Hello, and welcome to The Brief Insight, your go to podcast for breaking down the latest trends, research, and policies shaping our world. Whether you're passionate about sustainability, global economics, or emerging innovations, this is where we simplify complex ideas to keep you informed and inspired. If you enjoy what you hear, don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to our channel, and share it with anyone looking for insights that matter. We're here every Monday and Friday, so hit that notification bell to stay updated. Your support helps us grow and continue bringing you sharp, relevant content that sparks conversation. Thank you for tuning into The Brief Insight. Now let's dive into today's topic.
All right, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be looking into something pretty fundamental to how we live our lives these days. Data centers.
Yeah, they're everywhere. But we're not just talking about like the buildings themselves, right?
Exactly. It's about how much power they use, and especially with all this buzz about AI, that's what we're really going to dig into today. And we've got some pretty interesting sources here to help us understand what's going on.
We do, yeah. A report from Goldman Sachs, some materials from Socomec, an article on trends from TechTarget, and a perspective on what's happening in Africa, all thanks to TM Forum. It's going to be a fascinating deep dive, I think.
Absolutely. So let's kick things off with that Goldman Sachs report. One other thing that really jumped out at me was this prediction that they have about power demand from data centers. They say it's going to jump by 165% by 2030.
Wow, 165%.
I know, right? That's more than double what it is now in just 7 years. That means we're going to need a lot more power plants just to keep these data centers running. But it's not just about the quantity of electricity. It's about the infrastructure, too, the grid itself. And according to Goldman Sachs, the main culprit behind all of this is AI.
Yeah, AI is really changing the game. The report even mentions this arms race in AI development, with everyone trying to build bigger and more powerful models.
Right. And all that processing power requires a lot of energy. It's not like your typical Google search, which uses a tiny amount of energy.
No, not at all. This is heavy-duty computing we're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's where Goldman Sachs really connects the dots between this huge growth in power demand and the rise of generative AI. These large language models, these LLMs like ChatGPT, for example, they need to be trained on massive amounts of data. And that training process is incredibly energy intensive.
So Socomec's materials actually give us a sense of how much energy we're already using just to keep the internet running.
Mm-hmm.
They cite the International Energy Agency, and they say that data centers already consume, get this, 2 to 3% of the world's electricity.
2 to 3%? That's a lot.
Yeah, but it gets even crazier. They project that this could potentially go up to 13% by 2030.
13%, wow.
It's a mind-boggling number, isn't it?
No.
So we're going from a pretty significant chunk of global electricity to a potentially huge one. And this brings us to the TechTarget article. They raise a really interesting point. They say that even though a lot of companies are moving their operations to the cloud, overall energy consumption by data centers is still going up.
Right. You'd think that moving things to the cloud would make things more efficient, wouldn't you?
Exactly. And they do highlight some of the efforts that hyperscale data centers are making to become more energy efficient. But then they throw in this kind of a curveball. They say that U.S. data center energy use more than doubled between 2017 and 2023.
That's a pretty big jump. What do they attribute that to?
AI servers.
Mm-hmm.
So even though there are efficiency gains happening, the increasing use of AI is driving up the demand so much that it's offsetting those gains. It's like we're running on a treadmill, trying to keep up but still falling behind. Now let's shift gears a bit and head over to Africa, thanks to the TM Forum article. What's interesting is that they're seeing a big increase in data center investment there too. And you know what's playing a key role in that? AI demand. It's a global phenomenon.
It seems like AI is really driving data center growth everywhere.
It is, but the thing is, the TM Forum article points out that Pan-African data center deployments are still way lower than in other parts of the world. So they're playing catch-up and they're facing some unique challenges. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Different regions have different needs and different starting points. So what's the overall takeaway from all of this for our listeners today?
Well, I think the main thing is to understand just how big this issue is becoming. We're talking about a massive increase in energy demand, driven primarily by AI, and it's happening all over the world. So we need to figure out how to meet this demand in a way that's sustainable. All right, let's really break down this demand growth. So according to Goldman Sachs, we can expect global data center power demand to jump by 50% by 2027.
50%. Just by 2027, that's only 4 years away.
Yeah, it's happening fast. And then, like we said before, that leads to the even bigger jump of 165% by 2030. And they really emphasize that the main reason for this is, the explosion of interest in generative AI and those power-hungry LLMs.
Right. Those LLMs need a ton of computing power to be trained, and that translates directly into energy consumption. The Tech Target article even goes into some specifics about how power-intensive this AI processing is. They mention these accelerated servers that are designed specifically to handle those complex calculations.
Yeah, I was reading about those. They're like the muscle cars of the server world.
Exactly. And to give you an idea of the difference in energy use, TechTarget compares a regular Google search to an AI-powered ChatGPT request. A regular search uses about 0.3 watt-hours, but a ChatGPT request uses about 2.9 watt-hours.
So it's almost 10 times more energy for a single query. That's incredible.
It is. And when you think about how many of those queries are happening every single day, the numbers just keep getting bigger and bigger.
Right. And then Socomec throws out that big number, the one we mentioned earlier, 13% of global power consumption by 2030. That's a huge chunk of the world's energy pie.
It is. To put that in perspective, Socomec gives some country-level examples. They say that in Ireland, data centers could be responsible for 30% of the country's entire electricity consumption by 2028.
30%. That's a third of their entire power grid. What about other countries?
Well, they mentioned France, too. Data centers there are expected to use around 2% of the total national electricity, and that's with France already having a pretty big data center presence.
So 2% in a country with a lot of data centers. Just imagine what it'll be like in places that are just starting to build out their infrastructure.
Right. And to really drive home the scale of this, Socomec compares the potential energy consumption of all data centers globally to the total energy used by a country like Japan.
Wow. It's like we're talking about the energy needs of an entire nation just for our online activities.
It is. It's really quite remarkable. Okay, so we've established the why behind this huge demand for energy, but let's talk about where all this growth is happening. Where are these data centers being backed?
Well, on a global level, Goldman Sachs points to Asia Pacific and North America as the regions with the most data center capacity right now, both in terms of power and physical space.
That makes sense. Those are the regions with the biggest economies and the most internet users.
Exactly. And within those regions, Goldman Sachs specifically calls out places like Northern Virginia, Beijing, Shanghai, and the San Francisco Bay Area as major hubs. They say it's because of the high levels of computing and data traffic in those areas, along with strong demand from businesses.
So those are the places where the action is right now. But what about future growth?
Well, here's an interesting tidbit from Goldman Sachs. Asia Pacific has seen the most data center capacity added over the past 10 years, but North America has the most planned capacity coming online in the next 5 years. So it seems like North America is poised for even more growth in the near future.
Interesting. So the balance might be shifting a bit. Now let's turn our attention to Africa, as highlighted by TM Forum. They're reporting a significant increase in data center investment there over the last 3 years.
Yeah, it's great to see that growth happening in new regions.
Absolutely. They specifically mentioned that at least 25 new independent data centers have become operational in Africa since 2022, and there are another 15 in the planning stages. So there's definitely momentum building.
That's good news. And TM Forum points to a lot of building activity happening in several key African countries. They mentioned Egypt, Kenya, Morocco, Nigeria, and South Africa as hotspots. And they suggest that this is all being driven by efforts to improve regulations, upgrade energy infrastructure, and boost connectivity in those countries.
It sounds like they're really trying to lay the groundwork for a thriving digital economy.
They are. And we're also seeing big international players getting involved. TM Forum mentions companies like Digital Realty and Equinix acquiring local data center providers in Africa.
That's a good sign. It shows that these companies see the potential for growth there.
Absolutely. And of course, all the major cloud providers, the big names like Alibaba, AWS, Google Cloud, Huawei, Oracle, Microsoft, they've all established a presence in Africa too. They started mostly in South Africa, but now they're expanding to other countries like Nigeria and Kenya.
It sounds like the African data center market is really heating up.
It is, but there's still a long way to go. TM Forum points out a pretty significant gap in data center capacity in Africa compared to other regions. They say that Pan-African deployments are below 1 megawatt per million people.
1 megawatt per million people, that doesn't sound like a lot.
It's not. In the Americas, it's 88.5 megawatts per million people. So there's a big difference there.
So they have some catching up to do.
Yeah. And TM Forum emphasizes that this really underscores Africa's reliance on data centers located outside the continent to handle their digital needs.
It's like they're importing their computing power.
Right. And to make things even more challenging, over half of Africa's existing data center capacity is concentrated in South Africa. So the rest of the continent has a lot of ground to make up. It's clear that there's a lot of potential in the African market, but there are also some serious challenges to overcome.
Okay, so we've talked about the demand for data centers and where it's happening, but now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the strain this puts on our resources. That's the big question, isn't it? How do we power all of this in a sustainable way?
Exactly. So COMEC breaks down the three main areas where data centers use energy: the servers themselves, which are running constantly, the cooling systems that keep them from overheating, and security systems that protect these facilities.
It's a lot of energy just to keep things running smoothly. And it's not just the total amount of energy either. It's also the density of that energy, as Goldman Sachs points out.
Right. They say that the power density inside data centers is likely to increase from 162 kilowatts per square foot to 176 kilowatts per square foot by 2027. And that's just the power for the equipment itself, not even counting the cooling and other support systems.
That's a lot of power packed into a small space. And that puts a lot of stress on the power grid.
It does. And Goldman Sachs highlights some of the limitations we face in increasing data center capacity. Utilities are having trouble expanding their transmission capacity because of things like permitting delays, supply chain issues, and the time and cost it takes to upgrade existing infrastructure.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The technology is moving faster than the infrastructure can keep up.
Exactly. And Goldman Sachs estimates that we'll need a whopping $720 billion in grid spending through 2030 just to support this data center growth. And the fact that it takes so long to get transmission projects approved and built is just another bottleneck.
So it's a real infrastructure challenge.
It is. And it's not just a problem in places like North America or Asia. Goldman Sachs also points to a surge in power demand in Europe that's being driven by data centers. This is actually reversing a previous trend of declining power consumption in the region. They're seeing a big jump in requests from data centers that need to connect to the grid.
So it's a global issue. The bottom line is that the strain on resources is huge. It's not just about the quantity of energy, it's about the concentration of that energy and the limits of our existing power grids. So what can we do about it? What are the solutions?
Well, that's where the idea of green data centers comes in. Both TechTarget and SOCOMEC talk about this movement towards more sustainable practices. The goal is to reduce the environmental impact of these energy-intensive facilities.
Makes sense. So how are they doing that? What are some of the specific initiatives?
Well, SOCOMEC highlights smart energy management as a key strategy. This involves using advanced monitoring systems to really track energy use and identify any areas where they can improve efficiency.
So it's about being smarter about how they use energy.
Exactly. They also talk about the importance of environmental certifications like LEED and Energy Star, which act as benchmarks for data centers that are committed to sustainability. And of course, there's the use of renewable energy, which is a big one. Data centers are increasingly looking at things like solar panels, purchasing green energy from utility providers, and moving away from fossil fuels.
I'm glad to hear that. Renewables are definitely the future.
They are. And TM Forum even mentions a green data center in Kenya that's powered by geothermal energy. It's really cool to see those kinds of innovations happening.
Yeah, using local resources like that is a great idea.
Another big area of focus is cooling because, that uses a ton of energy. SOCOMEC talks about techniques like adiabatic cooling, free cooling, and cold-hot aisle containment, which are all ways to make cooling more efficient.
Cooling is definitely a big piece of the puzzle.
It is. Goldman Sachs even says that cooling can account for 35 to 40% of a hyperscaler's total energy use. So any gains there make a big difference.
Absolutely. So what else are they doing to reduce energy consumption?
Well, both SOCOMEC and TechTarget mention virtualization and consolidation of servers as important strategies. This involves reducing the number of physical servers by running multiple virtual servers on a single machine. It's like carpooling for servers.
Makes sense. Less hardware means less energy used.
Exactly. And water conservation is also becoming a focus. Sokamek mentions the use of recycled water in cooling systems to reduce the demand on freshwater resources.
Water is a precious resource, so that's good to hear.
It is. And then there's this really cool idea called heat recycling, where they capture the heat generated by data centers and use it to warm nearby buildings or for other purposes. It's like turning waste into a resource.
That's a great example of circularity. TechTarget actually has a pretty comprehensive list of green data center strategies. They mention things like efficient data storage and server power measures, like getting rid of unused hardware and using power management features on the server.
Right, right.
And they also talk about the importance of eco-friendly data center buildings that are made with low carbon and locally sourced materials.
Yeah, the construction process itself can have a big impact.
It can. Even choosing where to build a data center is becoming a green consideration. Factors like access to low-cost renewable energy, reliable telecom infrastructure, and even naturally cooler climates are all being considered.
So it's a holistic approach, looking at every aspect of the data center lifecycle.
It is. And they also talk about the importance of evaluating the eco-friendliness of utility providers and their efforts to improve grid efficiency. It's about working together to create a more sustainable system.
Absolutely. It's a team effort. And TechTarget mentions some really interesting new economic practices, like data centers collaborating with electric companies to help balance the grid and adopting circular economy principles. It's about thinking outside the box and finding new ways to do things. And then there's the use of monitoring tools and life cycle assessments to track energy use and identify inefficiencies.
Data is key, right? You can't improve what you don't measure.
Exactly. And finally, they talk about flexible operational strategies like investing in more energy-efficient processors and constantly monitoring power usage to make adjustments as needed. It's about being adaptable and always looking for ways to improve.
So there are a lot of different approaches being taken. What about some specific examples of companies that are really leading the charge?
Well, Sokamak highlights Google's efforts in this area. They're using their DeepMind AI to optimize energy use in their data centers. And they've even redesigned their servers to be more efficient.
Yeah, I've heard about that. They're really pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
They are. And they claim that their data centers are twice as energy efficient as a typical organization.
That's impressive. What about other companies?
Well, TechTarget mentions AWS and their ambitious sustainability goals. They're aiming for net zero carbon emissions by 2040 and 100% renewable energy by 2025.
Wow, those are some ambitious goals.
They are. And they're already making progress. TechTarget notes that AWS's infrastructure is more energy efficient than the average data center in both Europe and the US.
It's encouraging to see these big companies taking the lead.
It is. And it's not just the big players. Sokamek is also developing and offering its own solutions, like high-efficiency UPS systems, advanced energy monitoring systems, and energy storage systems to help integrate renewable energy and provide backup power. So there's a lot of innovation happening on the technology side, which is really promising.
Okay, so we've seen that there are a lot of positive steps being taken, but let's go back to Africa for a moment. What are the specific drivers of data center demand there, and what are some of the unique challenges they face?
Well, TM Forum explains that the demand for data centers in Africa is being driven by a few key things. One is the need to keep internet content and data localized within the continent. Another is the decentralization of cloud infrastructure, with major providers expanding their reach. And then there's the overall digitalization that's happening in businesses and governments across Africa.
So they're facing the same global trends as other regions.
Exactly. But they're also facing some unique challenges. One of the biggest is the unreliable power supply in many parts of Africa.
Yeah, that's a major hurdle.
It is. And TM Forum also mentions slower rates of digital and cloud adoption, economic volatility, political instability in some areas, bureaucratic processes, and unreliable connectivity as obstacles to growth. It's definitely a more complex environment than some other regions.
It sounds like it. But are there any bright spots?
Well, TM Forum points out an interesting dynamic. The very unreliability of energy supply in some regions can actually drive the adoption of colocation and cloud services. Businesses might look to offload the responsibility and cost of ensuring a reliable power supply to specialized providers. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
That's fascinating. It's like a case where a problem actually creates an opportunity.
Exactly. And they also mentioned that the recent disruptions caused by undersea cable outages have highlighted the vulnerability of relying solely on data centers located outside the continent. So that might actually encourage more investment in local data centers.
So there are some potential silver linings to the challenges.
There are. And TM Forum does note that several African countries are actively working to improve their regulations, upgrade their energy infrastructure, and enhance connectivity, which is a positive sign.
It sounds like they're taking the right steps to create a more sustainable environment for growth.
They are. And finally, let's touch on the investment landscape in the data center market, as outlined by Goldman Sachs. It sounds like there are opportunities for all sorts of investors.
Yeah, they highlight an increasing range of opportunities. Everything from the hyperscalers themselves, as they continue to grow and integrate AI into their services, to asset managers looking for long-term investments.
Right. Utilities are getting involved too, since they need to invest in grid expansion to meet the growing demand. And of course, there are the data center operators themselves who are right on the front lines of this growth. It's a dynamic and evolving market that's attracting a lot of attention.
It sounds like it. So what are the key takeaways from all of this for our listeners?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that data centers are becoming increasingly important to our lives, but they also come with a significant energy cost. And that cost is only going to go up as AI becomes more prevalent. But the good news is that there are a lot of innovative solutions being developed and implemented to make data centers more sustainable. It's a complex challenge, but it's one that we need to address head-on.
I agree. It's a global issue that requires a global effort. So what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with today?
I think it's this. Our increasing reliance on digital services, especially AI, is directly tied to the energy consumption of data centers. The choices we make, both as individuals and as a society, about how we use and develop these technologies will have a huge impact on our energy future. It's something we all need to think about.